Last September, a kayaker was paddling a remote stretch of the Manistee River when he heard heavy footsteps on the bank above him. Bipedal, 2 legs, matching his speed exactly. When he stopped paddling, the footsteps stopped. When he started again, they started again. For a quarter mile, something walked alongside him through thick brush, keeping pace, staying just out of sight. He could hear the weight behind every step, branches cracking, and then the breathing, deep, raspy, rhythmic, like a large animal panting after a run, except it was not running. It was walking, calmly, deliberately, like it wanted him to know it was there. He crossed to the opposite bank and waited until the sound stopped. When he went back later and checked the mud, he found tracks, canine in shape, pressed deep, spaced at intervals that only make sense if whatever left them was walking on 2 legs. He submitted the report. He was one of 47. Last year, 47 people across Michigan reported encountering the same thing, a Dogman. 7 feet tall, bipedal, canine head, built like nothing in any field guide. Hunters, truck drivers, homeowners, a retired state trooper, a mail carrier who saw one standing in the middle of her route in broad daylight. 47 reports went into the Michigan DNR system. Not one was investigated. Not one witness received a callback. The agency responsible for every wild animal in the state made a decision to say absolutely nothing. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you are watching from. Thanks. My name is Alex, and I have spent the last 3 months doing something that the Michigan Department of Natural Resources apparently has zero interest in doing. I compiled every reported Dogman sighting in the state of Michigan from a single calendar year. I pulled from online encounter databases, from the North American Dogman Project archives, from BFRO adjacent report systems, from Reddit threads with verifiable location data, from local news stories where the animal description was scrubbed or softened to read as a large canine or unusual predator, from police dispatch logs that referenced unknown animal or large bipedal animal, and from direct emails that many of you sent me after my previous Michigan videos. I cross-referenced every single report by date, location, and physical description. I threw out anything that could reasonably be explained as a bear, a wolf, a coyote, or a person in unusual circumstances. I threw out reports too vague to pin to a map. I threw out duplicates and obvious hoaxes. I was ruthless about the filtering because I wanted the number that survived to mean something. What I was left with was 47. 47 Dogman sightings in one state in a single year, reported by hunters, rural homeowners, long-haul truckers, hikers, campers, kayakers, and law enforcement officers across multiple counties stretching from the Upper Peninsula to the rural edges of southeastern Michigan. 47 people who saw something that matched the same physical description, the same behavioral profile, and the same pattern of encounter that witnesses have been reporting in Michigan since the 1880s. And the state agency with the funding, the personnel, the scientific infrastructure, and the legal mandate to investigate threats to public safety in the outdoors said absolutely nothing. Not a press release, not a wildlife advisory, not an internal memo that anyone has been willing to show me, not even a follow-up phone call to a single one of those 47 witnesses. I personally think that silence is the most important part of this entire story, and we are going to break it apart today. Before we get into the data, I need to put this in historical context because Michigan is not new to the Dogman. This state has one of the deepest and richest histories of Dogman encounters anywhere in North America, and the roots go back centuries before any Europeans set foot in these forests. The Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi peoples who inhabited the Great Lakes region had oral traditions describing beings that walked on 2 legs, with the heads and features of wolves. These were not casual stories told around fires for entertainment. They were woven into spiritual practice, into territorial knowledge, and into survival instruction that was passed from elders to children with the same seriousness as lessons about which plants were poisonous, or which rivers flooded in spring. The Ojibwe in particular spoke of entities tied to the deep forests and the waterways, beings that occupied a boundary space between the animal world and the spirit world. Some traditions described them as guardians of certain places, protectors of land that humans were not meant to enter. Others described them as predators with intelligence that exceeded any animal and rivaled any human. The details varied by region and by clan, but certain core elements remained remarkably consistent across tribal nations, separated by hundreds of miles and by linguistic barriers that should have prevented the kind of cultural contamination that skeptics love to invoke. Bipedal movement, canine head and features, extreme height and physical power, nocturnal activity, a strong territorial association with water, and a clear pattern of avoidance behavior. Places where the Dogman was known to dwell were places where people did not go, not because of vague fear, but because of accumulated generational knowledge about what lived there and what it was capable of doing. The Potawatomi had their own traditions about shape-shifting beings connected to the forests of lower Michigan. Accounts collected by early French missionaries reference ceremonies designed to appease or acknowledge the presence of wolf spirits in specific territories. The missionaries dismissed these as pagan superstition, of course. They did not consider the possibility that the indigenous peoples were describing something they had directly observed and had been observing for thousands of years. When elders marked a stretch of forest or a lake shore as forbidden territory, it was not because they were afraid of fairy tales. It was because something lived there that demanded a wide berth, and the price of ignoring that knowledge was paid in blood. European settlers in Michigan began recording their own encounters almost as soon as they pushed beyond the coastal settlements and into the interior. The earliest well-documented account comes from Wexford County in 1887, when two lumberjacks working a timber camp described seeing a creature that walked upright on two legs, but had the head and snout of a large dog. The description was specific and disturbing enough to be recorded in local journals and letters home, despite the ridicule it would have invited from anyone who had not seen it themselves. These were not men given to imagination. They were workers in one of the most physically brutal industries on the American frontier, men who spent every waking hour surrounded by wolves, black bears, and the kind of danger that left no room for fantasy. The pattern continued building through the early 20th century. Reports accumulated in the northern Lower Peninsula and the Upper Peninsula, concentrated in heavily forested areas near rivers, lakes, and creek systems. Witnesses described the same physical profile with a consistency that should have raised questions in any serious scientific mind. The famous 1938 account from Robert Fortney near Paris, Michigan, added another layer. Fortney described encountering a pack of wild dogs along a river, one of which stood upright on its hind legs and watched him with a focused, calculating intelligence that made the hair on his neck stand up and sent him retreating from his fishing spot. He was a grown man, experienced in the outdoors, and whatever he saw that day stayed with him for the rest of his life. The Michigan Dogman song, recorded by radio DJ Steve Cook in 1987, turned an underground phenomenon into a statewide conversation. Cook compiled historical sightings into lyrics set to a folk melody and aired it as an April Fool's joke. The response stunned him. Instead of laughter, he received hundreds of calls and letters from people across Michigan who had been keeping their own encounters private, some for decades. People heard the song and realized they were not crazy, that what they had seen was something others had seen too. The song popularized the theory that Michigan Dogman sightings follow a decennial cycle, spiking in years ending in 7. The historical data partially supports this. There are noticeable upticks in sighting frequency during certain periods, but the 47 reports I compiled prove that Dogman activity in Michigan does not pause between cycle years. It is persistent, ongoing, and far more frequent than even dedicated researchers have assumed. Now let me walk you through what those 47 sightings look like when you stop treating them as isolated anecdotes and start treating them as data points on a map, because the geographic patterns that emerge are, I personally believe, the most significant finding in this entire investigation. When you plot all 47 locations across a map of Michigan, 3 distinct clusters appear, and the placement of those clusters tells a story that the DNR should be paying very close attention to. The first and densest cluster sits in the northern Lower Peninsula, concentrated around the Manistee National Forest corridor and the counties surrounding Cadillac, Luther, and the Wexford-Missaukee border. This is deep timber country, vast tracts of state and national forest interspersed with small rural communities. seasonal hunting camps, and networks of logging roads and 2-tracks that see minimal human traffic outside of deer season. The forest here is mixed hardwood and conifer, broken by creek systems and river valleys that create natural corridors through the landscape. If you have watched my previous videos on the Michigan police officer's Dogman encounter, that incident occurred squarely inside this cluster. At the time, I treated it as an isolated event. It is not. That sighting is one data point in a concentration that includes multiple encounters within a 20-mile radius of the same stretch of highway. The second cluster sits in the Upper Peninsula, anchored around the Huron Mountains and stretching west toward the Porcupine Mountains Wilderness State Park. This is some of the most remote and least developed terrain in the eastern half of the United States. Population density is measured in single digits per square mile. The forest includes stretches of old-growth timber that have never been logged, and the landscape is broken by rivers, bogs, rocky ridgelines, and wetland complexes that create the kind of inaccessible, varied terrain that a large, intelligent nocturnal predator would use to maintain a home range while avoiding human detection almost entirely. The third cluster caught me off guard. It sits in southeastern Michigan, along the rural edges of Washtenaw and Livingston counties, in the transitional zone where the suburban sprawl of the Detroit-Ann Arbor corridor gives way to active farmland and state game areas. This is not wilderness. This is an hour from downtown Detroit. But when you look at the actual terrain rather than the population maps, it starts to make sense. There are large contiguous blocks of state land in this region. There are dense river corridors following the Huron River system. There are vast agricultural fields bordered on their edges by thick timber that creates travel routes connecting fragmented forest blocks. If something large and primarily nocturnal needed to move through southeastern Michigan without being observed, those corridors would be exactly how it would do it. And here is the detail that I think changes this conversation entirely. The 47 sightings do not scatter randomly across the map. They follow lines. Specifically, they follow waterways, state forest boundaries, and the same established wildlife corridors that wolves, coyotes, and white-tailed deer use to move across the state of Michigan. The DNR's own wildlife management maps, which track the movement patterns of Michigan's known large predators, overlay almost perfectly with the sighting clusters and the connecting lines between them. I spent a week comparing the two datasets, and the correlation is striking. I personally think this is the most important detail in the entire video, because it suggests that whatever people are seeing is not randomly materializing in backyards and parking lots. It is using the same landscape infrastructure that every other large predator in Michigan uses. It is behaving like a biological animal with a home range, travel routes, and a territorial logic that maps onto the geography that wildlife biologists already study and already understand. Now I want to tell you about some of the individual encounters within the 47, because the number only means something when you hear what the people behind it actually experienced. I have changed identifying details to protect the witnesses who shared their accounts with me, but the locations and descriptions are accurate to what was reported. A woman living on a rural property outside Luther, Michigan, began finding her chickens killed in early October. Not scattered by coyotes, not dragged off by foxes, not chewed by raccoons, crushed. The carcasses showed no bite marks, no tearing, no typical predator damage at all. The rib cages were collapsed inward as if something had squeezed them with tremendous force. She lost 6 chickens over 2 weeks in this manner. She set up a trail camera on a fence post near the coop, aimed at the tree line where the property bordered state forest. For 2 weeks, the camera captured deer, raccoons, a fox, and one blurry coyote at the edge of its range. Then one night at 3:14 in the morning, it triggered and captured a single frame of a tall, dark, bipedal figure standing at the tree line approximately 60 yards from the coop. The figure was facing the camera. The proportions were unmistakable. Wide shoulders tapering to a narrow waist, long arms hanging well past the hips, a head shape that wasn't human and not bare, pointed at the top with what appeared to be erect ears. She showed the image to her neighbor, a retired DNR wildlife officer. He studied it for a long time and told her it was probably a bear standing upright. She asked him to look at the image one more time and tell her honestly if that silhouette, those proportions, that head shape, looked like any bear he had ever seen in 40 years of fieldwork. He did not answer. She filed reports with 2 online databases and called the active DNR field office. She never received a call back. A long-haul trucker was running US 131 north of Big Rapids at approximately 3 in the morning on a clear October night when something stepped onto the highway ahead of him. His headlights caught it full on at a distance of about 100 yards. He described it as standing fully upright, easily 7 feet tall, with a dark coat of fur and a head that he initially thought was a person wearing some kind of Halloween mask, because his brain could not process what he was actually seeing. Then the Dogman turned its head toward the truck, and he saw the muzzle, the ears, the reflective green shine of eyes that were spaced too wide and set too far forward to be anything human. He braked hard and swerved into the left lane. The Dogman dropped to all fours in a single explosive motion, like a sprinter launching from blocks, and cleared the roadside ditch in one bound that carried it into the tree line before the truck had even stopped rocking from the swerve. He described the transition from upright to quadrupedal as seamless, not the awkward topple of a bear dropping down, but a fluid shift that looked practiced, natural, like something that moved between 2 and 4 legs as easily as a human switches between walking and running. He pulled over a mile down the road and sat in his locked cab for 20 minutes, with his hands shaking before he could drive again. A kayaker paddling a remote section of the Manistee River in late September heard heavy bipedal footsteps on the elevated bank to his right, matching his pace and holding a parallel course through heavy riverside brush. The footsteps stayed with him for over a quarter mile. When he stopped paddling and let the current carry him, the footsteps stopped. When he resumed, they resumed. The synchronization was too precise to be coincidence. He never saw what was making the sound because the bank rose 6 or 7 feet above the water, and the vegetation was thick with autumn growth. But he could hear the weight behind each step, the crack of dry branches, the rustle of disturbed brush, and at one point he heard heavy breathing, a deep rhythmic panting that sounded like a large canine after exertion. He paddled hard to the opposite bank and waited, pressed against a fallen tree with his paddle across his knees, until the sounds stopped completely. When he reached the takeout point downstream, he hiked back along the bank where the footsteps had followed him. The mud showed tracks. They were large, canine in shape, deeply pressed into soft earth, and spaced at intervals that were consistent with a bipedal stride roughly twice the length of a human's. He photographed the tracks and submitted the images to the North American Dogman project, a deer hunter in the Upper Peninsula, sitting in a ground blind on the edge of a frozen bog near the Porcupine Mountains during firearms season, watched a dogman walk across open ground at a distance of roughly 80 yards in mid-afternoon. The light was flat and gray under heavy overcast, which made the encounter unusual because the vast majority of sightings happen at dusk or after dark. The dogman was moving at a steady walk, fully upright, with a slight forward lean and arms swinging in a way that looked disturbingly close to a human's natural gait, but was clearly not human. The legs were too long relative to the torso. The arms hung too low, nearly to the knees, and the head, even at 80 yards through binoculars, was unmistakably canine, a long, dark muzzle and erect, pointed ears. The dogman crossed the entire width of the open bog without once pausing, without once looking in the hunter's direction, and disappeared into the black spruce on the far side. The hunter told me that the physical appearance of the dogman was not what disturbed him the most. What disturbed him was the silence. Every bird in the area, every jay, every chickadee, every raven, went completely silent the moment the dogman appeared at the edge of the bog. The silence lasted for at least 10 minutes after it had passed and vanished into the spruce. The forest treated the dogman the way it treats an apex predator at the top of the food chain. Everything in the ecosystem yielded to its presence. A family on a small hobby farm near the Washtenaw-Livingston County line in southeastern Michigan experienced a series of escalating events over several weeks in early autumn. It started with their dogs, 2 large mixed-breed rescues that had never shown fear of anything. Dogs that had chased coyotes off the property and stood their ground against raccoons and stray dogs began refusing to go outside after dark. They would plant themselves at the back door and whine, ears flat, tails tucked, trembling. Then the livestock disturbances started. Goats found huddled in the far corner of their pen at dawn, pressed together and visibly distressed. Chickens killed overnight, with the same crushing pattern reported across the state. No bite marks, no tearing. Rib cages collapsed as if wrapped and squeezed by something with tremendous constricting force. Then one evening at dusk, just as the light was failing, the family's teenage son was walking back from the barn when he saw a tall, dark figure standing motionless at the fence line where their property met a state game area. He described the Dogman as perfectly still, facing the house, with its long arms at its sides and its head tilted slightly to one side as if it was studying him. When he turned and ran inside, it did not move. It just stood there, watching. His parents went out with flashlights and found nothing at the fence line, but the ground was soft from recent rain, and it showed what they found. Large canine-shaped impressions pressed deep into the mud, spaced at bipedal stride intervals. They called the DNR. The officer who eventually returned their call several days later told them it was probably a coyote, and that coyotes could appear very large in low-light conditions. When they pressed about the bipedal tracks and the crushed livestock, the conversation ended quickly. A retired state police officer living in a rural area south of Grayling called me directly after watching one of my previous Michigan videos. He told me he had never spoken publicly about what happened to him, and he wanted to keep his identity protected, but he felt it was important that someone documented it. He was driving home from a late shift on a county road that runs through heavy state forest between Grayling and Roscommon. It was roughly 2 a.m, late October, cold enough that frost was forming on the road. His headlights picked up a shape on the right shoulder, and his training kicked in automatically. He slowed and angled his headlights toward the shape, expecting a deer carcass or a piece of debris. What he saw was a dogman crouched on the shoulder of the road, hunched over something on the ground. The dogman's back was toward him, and he could see the width of the shoulders, the dark fur, and the shape of the head in profile when it turned slightly at the sound of his vehicle. He described the head as distinctly canine, a long muzzle visible even in the harsh white of the headlights, and the body as massive, easily 300 pounds or more based on the frame he was looking at. The dogman stood upright from its crouched position in one smooth motion, turned toward the tree line, and walked into the forest on 2 legs, without running, without haste. He sat in his cruiser for 5 minutes with his service weapon drawn before he got out to look at the road shoulder. There was a deer carcass on the pavement. It had been crushed across the midsection, ribs broken inward but not bitten, not torn. He did not file an official report because he knew exactly what would happen to his credibility if he did. He told one colleague, who told him to forget about it. 2 college students camping in the Huron National Forest in September set up a tent near a creek in a designated backcountry site. They built a fire, ate dinner, and turned in around 10. Sometime after midnight, they were woken by the sound of something circling their campsite. The footsteps were heavy and bipedal, crunching through dry leaves and snapping sticks. The circle tightened over the course of 10 or 15 minutes, each pass bringing the sound closer. They lay in their tent in the dark, too frightened to move or speak, listening as the dogman walked around and around them in a slow, deliberate orbit. At one point, the footsteps stopped directly outside the tent wall. They heard heavy breathing, a deep, raspy exhalation that sounded like it was coming from something with a chest much larger than a human's. They could smell it. A sharp, musky odor like wet dog mixed with something rotting. Then the footsteps resumed and gradually moved away toward the creek. They did not leave the tent until well after sunrise. The ground around their campsite showed a clear circular track of large, deep canine-shaped prints spaced at bipedal intervals. They packed up and hiked out that morning. One of them submitted a detailed report with photographs of the tracks. The other refuses to discuss it. A farmer in Missaukee County found a heifer dead in his pasture one morning in late October. The animal had not been bitten or clawed. It had been crushed. The midsection was compressed as if something had wrapped around it and squeezed with a force that broke the ribs inward and ruptured internal organs. The farmer had been raising cattle for 25 years and had lost animals to coyotes, to disease, to difficult births, and once to a lightning strike. He had never seen damage like this. He called his veterinarian, who examined the carcass and could not provide an explanation. The vet told him it looked like constriction damage, like something a very large snake would do, except that no snake in Michigan is remotely large enough to crush a heifer. The farmer installed trail cameras around his pasture perimeter that night. Over the next 3 weeks, the cameras captured deer, coyotes, a black bear passing through, and raccoons. Then one camera on the north fence line triggered at 4 in the morning and recorded 6 seconds of video showing a large bipedal figure moving along the tree line at the edge of the pasture. The figure was dark, upright, and moved with a smooth, purposeful stride that covered ground quickly. The Dogman passed through the camera's field of view in 3 seconds and was gone. The farmer showed the video to me. He didn't show it to the DNR because his neighbor, the retired wildlife officer I mentioned earlier, had already told him what the response would be. A mail carrier on a rural route in Osceola County had an encounter in broad daylight that shook her badly enough to take 2 weeks off work. She was driving a stretch of gravel road bordered by thick state forest on both sides, delivering to scattered rural mailboxes the way she had done 5 days a week for 8 years. A dogman stepped out of the tree line approximately 50 yards ahead of her vehicle and stood in the middle of the road, facing her. It was mid-morning, clear sky, full sun. There was no ambiguity about the light, no dust shadows to confuse the image. She described the dogman as standing between 7 and 8 feet tall, covered in grayish-brown fur with a head that was unmistakably canine. The ears were erect, the muzzle was long and dark, and the eyes reflected light even in daylight in a way that animal eyes do, but human eyes do not. The dogman stood in the road and looked at her vehicle for what she estimated was 4 or 5 seconds. Then it turned and walked back into the forest on 2 legs, disappearing into the trees without looking back. She drove past the spot where it had stood and saw large canine tracks pressed into the soft gravel shoulder. She did not stop. She did not report it to anyone official. She told her husband and her sister, and then 6 months later she emailed me. Her hands were still shaking when she typed the message. She could tell because the email was full of typos she went back and corrected. That detail, more than anything else in her account, convinced me she was telling the truth. Those are 8 encounters out of the 47. Every single one of the 47 shares common threads that are difficult to dismiss individually and almost impossible to dismiss collectively. The sightings overwhelmingly occurred between dusk and dawn. The majority took place in the fall and early winter months. Nearly all were within a mile of a significant water source, and the vast majority of witnesses had no prior knowledge of the dogman phenomenon, no interest in cryptids, no history of unusual claims. Several witnesses told me they had to search the internet after their encounter to find out if anyone else had ever seen what they saw. These are not people who went looking for something strange in the Michigan woods. Something strange found them. So let us talk about the DNR's silence and why it matters. The Michigan Department of Natural Resources is the state agency responsible for managing every wild animal, every state forest, every game area, and every public waterway in Michigan. When a citizen reports an unusual or potentially dangerous animal, the DNR is the institution with the scientific staff, the field equipment, the legal authority, and the taxpayer funding to investigate. That is their job. That is what they exist to do. I filed Freedom of Information Act requests with the Michigan DNR regarding internal communications about animal reports that did not match the profiles of known Michigan species. What I received back was limited, heavily redacted in certain sections, and carefully worded in the way that government documents are always carefully worded when someone does not want to say too much. But what came through in the documents that were released is revealing. There are internal incident logs in the DNR's own record system that reference reports of a large bipedal animal, unidentified large predator, and unusual canid activity in counties that overlap exactly with the 3 clusters I mapped independently. These entries exist. They are logged, they are time-stamped, and they are never acted upon. No follow-up investigation, no field biologist dispatched, no track casting, no trail camera deployment, no witness interview. The reports enter the system and they sit there, inert, until the retention period expires and they vanish. The reason for this silence is not mysterious, and it is not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense that people imagine when they hear the word. It is something much more ordinary and in some ways much worse. It is institutional self-preservation driven by economic incentive. Michigan's outdoor recreation economy is enormous. Hunting licenses, fishing licenses, state park permits, campground fees, and the tourism revenue generated by the state's forests and waterways collectively amount to billions of dollars in annual economic activity. The DNR's own operating budget depends in significant part on this revenue stream. A public advisory about an unknown large predator operating in Michigan's most popular hunting and recreation areas would be a bureaucratic disaster of the highest order. It would trigger media attention, public panic, political scrutiny, demands for answers that the DNR does not have, and potential economic consequences that no state agency wants to be responsible for. I personally think what the DNR is doing is not a cover-up. It is something more insidious. It is a deliberate policy of non-investigation designed to ensure that there is never any official evidence to cover up in the first place. If you never send a biologist to examine the tracks, there are no track casts in the file. If you never follow up with a witness, there is no sworn statement on record. If you never deploy cameras, there is no footage to classify. If you never commission a study, there are no findings to suppress or release. The absence of evidence becomes self-reinforcing because the absence is engineered by the refusal to look. This is the exact same playbook that state wildlife agencies across the country have used for decades when confronted with mountain lion sightings in states where the species is officially extirpated. Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Michigan itself spent years telling citizens that mountain lions did not exist in their state, dismissing hundreds of credible reports from experienced outdoors people, until trail camera footage or a dead animal on a highway forced them to acknowledge what witnesses had been saying all along. The pattern is identical across species and states. Deny, deflect, reclassify, call it a bear, call it a coyote, call it a trick of the light, and when the witness insists on what they saw, go quiet and wait for them to give up. What makes the DNR's handling of the Dogman reports particularly frustrating is the contrast between how they treat different types of unusual animal sightings. When a cougar is photographed by a trail camera in Michigan, even though the species is officially considered extirpated from the state, the DNR will eventually confirm the sighting, issue a brief statement, and move on. They do this because cougars are a known species with an established biological record. Confirming a cougar sighting does not challenge the fundamental framework of wildlife biology. It is simply an animal showing up where it is not expected. But a 7-foot bipedal canid is a different problem entirely. Confirming that would not just be a wildlife advisory. It would be an admission that the state's scientific understanding of its own ecosystem has a gap large enough to fit a creature that should not exist according to any accepted taxonomy. No bureaucrat in any state agency anywhere is going to volunteer for that conversation. The professional and institutional consequences of being the person who confirmed the Dogman would be career-ending, regardless of the evidence. And so the silence continues. I actually spoke with a former DNR employee who left the department several years ago. This person asked to remain anonymous for obvious reasons, but they told me something I found deeply revealing. They said that within the department there was an informal understanding that certain types of reports were simply not pursued. Not because of any written policy or directive from above, but because of institutional culture. If you were a field biologist and you received a call about a large bipedal animal, you logged it, you classified it as probable bear, and you moved on to the next item on your list. Nobody was going to reward you for investigating something that might make the department look foolish. Nobody was going to thank you for generating media attention that the director would then have to address in press conferences. The path of least resistance was to log it and forget it. And that is exactly what happened with every single one of the 47 reports that entered the DNR system. I want to address the skeptical arguments head-on, because I respect honest skepticism, and I think it makes the case stronger to engage with it rather than dodge it. The most common counter-argument is bear misidentification. Black bears stand on their hind legs. In poor light, a large bear standing upright could theoretically be mistaken for something more exotic. I accept that this explains some individual sightings in some specific circumstances, but it cannot explain the full pattern. Bears stand upright briefly and awkwardly, typically to get a better vantage point or to reach food. They do not walk bipedally at a sustained pace across open ground. They do not have elongated canine muzzles. They do not have pointed erect ears. They do not drop to all fours in a single fluid explosive motion and clear a highway ditch in one bound. Multiple witnesses in the 47 specifically identified sustained bipedal locomotion and a distinctly canine head as the two details that eliminated bear from their consideration immediately and completely. The second argument is cultural contamination. People see Dogman because they have heard about Dogman and their frightened brains fill in the blanks. This would be a strong argument if the witnesses were Dogman enthusiasts who went into the woods hoping to see something unusual. They are not. The overwhelming majority of the 47 had never heard the word Dogman before their encounter. Several described having to search online for hours before finding a term that matched what they saw. You cannot be contaminated by a cultural template that you have never been exposed to. The consistency of descriptions across witnesses who share no connection to the cryptid community and no knowledge of each other's reports is not evidence of contamination. It is evidence that they are describing the same real thing. The third and strongest argument is the absence of hard physical proof. No body, no bones, no definitive DNA on record. I do not wave this away. It is a legitimate scientific challenge. But absence of a specimen is not proof of non-existence. The mountain gorilla was a myth in Western science until 1902. New large mammal species have been formally described as recently as the last 2 decades. The forests of northern Michigan are vast, dense, poorly surveyed, and in many areas rarely visited by humans outside of a 2-week window during deer season. If a species existed that was primarily nocturnal, highly intelligent, powerfully mobile, and instinctively avoidant of human contact, the probability of recovering physical remains would be extremely low, regardless of population density. We have never recovered remains of many species we know exist in low numbers in remote habitat. The absence of a Dogman carcass in a museum drawer does not mean the species is imaginary. It means we have not found one yet, and given that no institution with the resources to conduct a serious search has ever tried, the absence should surprise no one. Let me put 47 in context because I think the historical pattern matters as much as the current data. Michigan Dogman sightings have been documented in written records since the 1887 Wexford County account, and in indigenous oral tradition for centuries before that. The sighting frequency has never been zero. There is no decade in the last 140 years where Michigan was free of Dogman reports. The volume fluctuates, and the decennial cycle theory suggests that years ending in 7 produce spikes, 1937, 1957, 1967, 1977, 1987, 1997, 2007, 2017. There is some statistical support for this. The years surrounding those dates do tend to show higher concentrations of reports, but the cycle theory has also created a false impression that the Dogman goes dormant between peak years, that it is a periodic phenomenon rather than a persistent one. The 47 sightings I compiled do not come from a cycle year. They come from an ordinary year, a year with no special significance in the decennial framework, a year when, by the logic of the cycle theory, the Dogman should be at its quietest. 47 sightings in a quiet year. Think about what that implies for a peak year. Think about what the real number might be during a cycle spike, when the already elevated baseline gets amplified by whatever factor drives the periodicity. I personally think the cycle theory captures something real about fluctuations in activity or visibility, but I also think it has distracted people from the more important truth, which is that the Dogman is active in Michigan every single year, cycle or not, and the frequency may actually be increasing. Is the increase real? Or is it an artifact of better reporting? That is a fair question, and one I have thought about carefully. More people carry trail cameras now than at any point in history. More people have smartphones with decent low-light cameras. More people know about encounter databases and are willing to submit reports online rather than keeping silent out of fear of ridicule. All of these factors contribute to an increase in documented sightings that might not reflect an actual increase in the Dogman population or activity level. I acknowledge this, but I also think it is not the whole explanation. Several of the witnesses in the 47 specifically told me that the Dogman they encountered was in a location where they had never seen or heard anything unusual in decades of using that land. The farmer in Missaukee County had been running cattle on that property for 25 years without a single unexplained livestock death. The bow hunter in Wexford County had been hunting that ridge since he was a teenager. Something changed. Whether the Dogman population is expanding, whether their range is shifting due to habitat pressure, or whether human encroachment into previously wild areas is creating more overlap between our territory and theirs. Something is different, and 47 reports in 1 year from one state is a data point that demands more than a shrug. I have been covering Dogman encounters on this channel for a while now, and with every video the picture gets clearer. As I covered in my video about the Michigan police officers who encountered a Dogman on a rural highway, and again in the hidden footage video about a captured Dogman in Michigan, this state keeps producing evidence that demands attention. The more I dig in, the more convinced I become that the sheer volume of consistent testimony is not a weakness in the case for the Dogman. It is the case. When dozens of unconnected people across thousands of square miles, spanning every demographic and background imaginable, independently describe the same animal with the same proportions exhibiting the same behaviors in locations that follow the same ecological corridors, that is not folklore, that is field data, and field data, in any legitimate scientific framework, demands investigation. Every one of those 47 people saw something that permanently changed their understanding of what shares this landscape with us. Every one of them reached out for acknowledgement, for investigation, for some institutional response that said your experience is real and we take it seriously. And every one of them was met with the same deafening silence from the one agency that could make a difference. I'm going to keep compiling these numbers. I'm going to keep mapping the clusters and tracking the corridors. Next year, I'm going to do this again and see how the data shifts. If you have had a Dogman encounter in Michigan or anywhere else, I want to hear from you. Your report matters. Your experience is valid, and this channel will always give you a platform to share it, even if the DNR will not. I personally believe we are approaching a tipping point where the weight of accumulated testimony becomes impossible for the institutions to ignore. 47 in one state in 1 year is a number that is very, very hard to explain away, and the next year's count may be even harder. The Dogman is in Michigan. It has always been in Michigan. The Ojibwe knew it. The Potawatomi knew it. The lumberjacks of the 1880s knew it. The hunters and farmers and truck drivers of today know it. And somewhere in the incident logs of the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, buried in a system that nobody is assigned to review, the state knows it too. They just have not figured out how to say it out loud. Until they do, the only people telling the truth about what lives in those forests are the witnesses, and I will keep amplifying their voices for as long as they keep coming forward. I want to end with something that the bow hunter from Wexford County told me when we spoke. He said that for the first month after his encounter, he could not go back into the woods. He sat in his living room during firearms season for the first time in 30 years and stared at the wall. His stand was still up in that oak tree. His broadheads were still sharp. His tags were still in his wallet. But every time he thought about walking back into that creek bottom at dusk, his body refused. Not his mind, his body. His hands would shake and his stomach would turn, and something deep in his nervous system would scream, no. He told me that he eventually did go back, but not to that stand, not to that ridge, and not alone. He hunts now with his son, on different land, in a different county. He told me that the Dogman did not just cross a logging road that evening. It crossed a line in his understanding of the world, and everything on the other side of that line looked different. That is what the DNR's silence costs. Not just institutional credibility, not just scientific integrity, but the well-being of real people who experienced something extraordinary and were told by the one institution that should care that their experience did not matter. Every one of those 47 witnesses carries a version of that bow hunter's story. Every one of them had their world rearranged in a matter of seconds, and every one of them reached out for help and found an empty line. I have said it before on this channel, and I will say it again. These witnesses deserve better. Michigan deserves better. And the truth, whatever it turns out to be, deserves to be pursued rather than buried in a log that nobody reads. 47. One state. 1 year. The DNR said nothing. But I am saying something. And next year, when I compile the numbers again, I expect that number to grow. Not because the Dogman is getting bolder, though it might be, but because the witnesses are. They are tired of being ignored. They are tired of being dismissed. And they are finding this channel and channels like it and realizing that their voices matter even when the institutions fail them. That is how the truth gets out. Not from the top down, from the ground up. One sighting at a time. For more stories like this, consider subscribing.